The intent of the corporation was basically to attempt to answer the many questions that have happened. If you've noticed on other issues, the city, especially if they're before the courts, the city always adopts a process of keeping it silent so that basically there can be fair decision-making in the process. We've given our last major press release, I think going back, was in January that we basically talked
concerning
about
Waterfront, January 28th.
And we've been working with the government on various other elements within the city that we needed to work on mutually. And the government has all documents. I mean, that's one of the questions we want to put to rest, that they have everything, including the lease, and they've had it for some time now.
When did they get them?
About 3 months ago.
Yeah, June. They've had it since June.
Okay. Why was there a delay between January and May and June getting them the lease?
Because initially, I think basically the lease was between two parties, and there may have been third-party interests that basically could cause legal issues for ourselves. So once we were comfortable that basically we were in a position, and also the developer was comfortable about it, we decided to hand it over. And certainly in working with government, we saw that their intentions were good. We gave them what they asked for, even though they're not technically a party to it.
The actual lease document.
Right. Do you? I mean, so you don't, in principle, appreciate that the government would want to see all the documents in order to do their due diligence. Is that what you said?
It's unprecedented in their relationship with City Hall. There are other agreements that City Hall has had historically that government are not party to or do not make either demands for to be party to. So it's consistent with the conventional way in which City Hall has done business for many years.
But in principle, is it a good idea for government to have all the documents? Regardless of the history, I'm just asking you, like, what's the right thing in principle to do?
To maintain the position that we took at the time.
Why?
The mayor had just answered that with the relationship between ourselves and a commercial party, it was the right thing to do. We maintained a position that was consistent with the relationship we had formed with our development partners and their subsequent partners.
When was the lease actually ratified?
December 13th, 2012.
How was it ratified?
By representatives of our council, consistent with how documents of that nature have been ratified in the past, comparable to the Parliament agreement. So it's all consistent with how City Hall conducts business.
Was it discussed at board?
Yeah, was there a resolution
Oh yes,
passed?
there's a
There was a
resolution.
resolution.
That goes back to October of last year.
Okay, so I guess the question is, I mean, the public has, the impression I get from people who are concerned about this is that nobody had any idea that the lease had been signed, that the property had been leased out.
Nobody. I mean, that's a very broad group of people. You just said nobody. Those who were party to it were fully aware of it.
Okay, the general public wasn't aware
Well,
of it.
general public are not party to any of the agreements that City Hall enters into from time to time. The building of our works depot, the leasing of properties that we own. The general public are not party to that process as it occurs. At some point in time, they may become aware of it, but there are successive leases that City Hall has entered into on a number of properties that the public would not be aware or have not demanded
And I think,
to have a...
yeah, I think
Right,
another,
well, I'm sorry, but you
another
keep-
important point is that basically in negotiation, you can negotiate a lease in the general public any more than the details of the Morgan Point lease as it was being negotiated wasn't done in a public setting. It was done in a private setting. I don't think you can go to the cabinet of the government and say, please give us the lease. The public want to see it before you sign it.
And
Okay,
I think that's why you pushed ahead with the January 28th press conference.
That is
Correct.
correct, yes.
Right, well, 2 points about that. You've mentioned several times now that historically things have been done this way. The conventional way of doing things is such and
Correct.
such. But when you went for election, when you actually asked the people of Hamilton to vote you in, you promised a different way of doing things. You said you will be transparent. You talked about accountability and things like that.
And
Now
I
you're
think-
saying it's going to be business as usual.
No,
we didn't
And
say
it's
that.
okay to do it
No,
that way.
I think you're making a sweeping interpretation from a generalization. I think what we set about at a very early stage of governance, and one of the things that was very contentious was the code of conduct. We looked at that as being a code that was layered over the city without taking the actual elected corporation's point of view. We redrafted it, strengthened it, improved it, got it through, shared it with government, and actually asked them to encode it actually so it's actually an enforceable code, which it isn't right now. We are a council of convention which basically does its business by resolution. There is no mechanism for how our board meets, how it does its business, other than the traditions of how it's always done it. We're looking at English legislation for local government acts to see how we can take modern best practices and update our act. Our act is a Victorian act that puts a lot of limitations on how the city can go about doing its business. Because in some cases, it's too wide and general that you can't actually even interpret from it what you can do.
Does the act prevent you from saying at that January 20th press conference that the property has been leased to the developer?
Does it prevent us?
Yeah.
No.
No.
So why didn't you tell the public
We told the public on January 28th.
that it was leased?
We told the public that we had entered into a relationship with Allied Development Partners.
Right.
But you didn't say the property
No,
was leased.
well, we didn't
It
say
wasn't
lease.
leased then.
The lease didn't
The
get
lease
signed until
No, that's,
December 31st.
no, the lease was signed December 13th,
Okay.
2012. What we announced is who we entered into that relationship with, which is Allied.
And they had a certain timeline, basically, to get, and the advice that we had from our consultant, that the biggest thing holding this up was finance. And until somebody could bring finance to the table, as the history of the waterfront can show, there's been a lot of talking and no action on it. So we understood that we had to partner with a development partner that could bring the cash to the table. And that sort of kind of cash for developing our waterfront was certainly not going to be found in Bermuda. And that we had to go outside and look for developers that do develop waterfront to partner with them. But there was also a sensitivity with our council that we want to make sure it was a team in the vetting process through who applied that was Bermudian-led. And that's what occurred in our vetting process of the submissions that came forward to us. We shortlisted 3, gave the first one that basically was the most complete, most comprehensive, the timeline of entering into agreement with. If they didn't provide the letter of credit, then they would fall away, and number 2 on the line would be basically put in position to be the developer of choice.
Okay, well, that doesn't answer the question why the public wasn't told about the lease.
Well,
But it wasn't
goes
signed
back-
then.
Yeah, it goes back to...
So when was it signed, though? I mean,
I've answered it a few times.
December
December 13th.
2012?
2012.
Okay, but your press conference was in January 2013.
Because what we were doing is we were waiting for the election to occur
Yeah.
to then meet with the government, whether it's the then sitting government or the new government, and to apprise them of the business we were conducting, which we attempted to do on several occasions.
For 9 weeks.
Yes.
You attempted to tell the government what you were doing.
Yeah.
That's right. Once the election occurred, we attempted several meetings to have with the government to apprise them of where we were with the waterfront project.
Okay, and those
We didn't know
attempts
which
failed.
government prior to the election we would be dealing with, to be quite honest.
The previous government knew of our activity regarding the waterfront as far as having seen the RFP, having spoken with the then Premier herself about the project. So they were aware of what we were doing. They unfortunately were voted out of office prior to us making the public announcement.
Okay, well, so by the time you had that press conference, the lease had been signed.
The lease had been signed.
Okay, and you didn't say at that press conference that the lease had been signed.
We said we had entered into an agreement with Allied Development Partners, which included a lease. We didn't specify lease in that press conference. I believe you were there that day.
Yeah, I was.
We didn't specify lease, but that was part of the development agreement with Allied, that they entered into a lease agreement and a development agreement with the Corporation of Hamilton.
So you understand why people were surprised when they learned
I shouldn't
that
think,
a 262-year lease
the
had been
layperson
signed.
might be surprised, but if you reference previous agreements with the government, which we took the template from them, on public lands, which 9 beaches, the Club Med property, and then inclusive of the Morgan's Point public land, the same sort of things occurred These things were negotiated, they were agreed upon by the parties concerned, and at some point subsequent to that, government made announcements about that. They did not necessarily occur the day of. Historically, you can look back and you'll see that these announcements came far later than the actual agreements were agreed upon. So it's not inconsistent with that. I'd like to also go back to one of the things the mayor said about when we took office and your question about when we were elected, promising to do business differently. We started day one trying to do the very thing, which is to put in place a framework, a policy framework of how the city would go about doing its business, because simply what we have is the Municipalities Act, which is very broad language and old language, and we have the conventional way in which it was done, which is by resolution. So there's no requirements for doing things regarding major developments or minor developments in a specified way according to a document which exists. It does not exist. We're working on that now. And that will probably satisfy.
So, sorry, just going back to this, the issue of public disclosure of the lease. You said a layperson may have been surprised, but when you hold a press conference, you are actually talking to the general public, meaning lay people. Okay, you're not talking to lawyers and accountants.
I think in talking with you now, we're talking
So-
like lawyers, because we've entered into agreement with Allied. I mean, it was clear to us that basically we were transferring that knowledge, that we were moving forward because we were partnering with the developer. It was more than just, talk.
Sure.
When were you planning to announce the actual lease to the public?
Keep in mind, at the date of that announcement, January 28th, this was a very fluid process which was going on with the team of individuals who were flown into Bermuda, who are the financiers and others. So that process was not a fait accompli as one might think it could be, because there was the issue of if Allied was unable to perform going forward, then we had recourse to move to the next shortlisted potential development team. So those sort of things like that are not inconsistent with how things have been done in the past, both as a city government or even a national government, in how things that are sensitive are handled in a very sensitive way. If you want to have relationships with partners that can bring the kind of capital and expertise to Bermuda that is needed to advance our economy, you have to provide that level of comfort and sensitivity to those concerns.
Who were the councillors who approved that resolution?
Well, one of the things we had a unanimous council resolution when we approved that.
It was a full council.
It was full council, that's right.
Approved the lease itself,
We approved the entire process.
including the lease.
That's
Everybody
right,
had a copy of
yes.
the lease and they looked at it and,
There was an electronic version
That's
that
right.
was shared with everybody.
okay.
There was one counselor that wanted to take the lease out of.
I think that's not even an important factor to,
But they all had,
all council persons have access to all information regarding our business.
And I think it's fair to say you're very excited about this.
We are. I think our excitement is only subdued by the fact that since the announcement, there's been this somewhat strained relationship between ourselves and the government on how we move forward on this here. But it goes back to the fact that we were actively engaged in moving this process ahead prior to the general election.